Our middle son, David, just started a new job a few months ago. He and his wife had moved to Southern California. She's starting a graduate program down there, and he got hired by a company that sells assessment testing to employers. So companies that do a lot of hiring use this testing for new applicants to try and figure out if they are a good fit for their business. And there's lots of different assessment tests out there, aren't there? When I started working with the sheriff's department as a chaplain, I had to take a psych test. Had to take it a couple times to pass. But I had to go through a polygraph, which that's a weird experience if you've never done a polygraph test. They ask you these very ambiguous questions like, have you ever broken the rules? Could you define that a little more for me? But they run you through these tests to try and decide if you're going to work in that job. When I work with young couples that are contemplating marriage, there is an assessment test that I give them that helps them understand how they view their relationship, themselves and each other. Because the point of all of those kinds of tests is we want to know what kind of people are we getting involved with. In fact, not just what kind of people are they, what kind of people are they going to be? What kind of employee is this person going to be? Are they going to take care of my company well, or are they going to be a flake? Are they going to rip me off? What kind of person am I marrying? Is this going to be a successful relationship, or is this going to be a relationship that is full of challenges and difficulty? Think about the kind of time and money and heartache you could save yourself if you knew ahead of time who all of the bad eggs were. I think every person who's ever owned a business would tell you they would love it if they knew day one what kind of an employee that new hire was going to be, if you could count on them or not. As you look at the earthly life of Jesus and the people that were around him, the people that followed him, the people he associated with, I wonder if Jesus ever thought to himself, it would have been nice to do some more assessment testing up front and know a little bit more about how some of these people were going to turn out. We've seen Jesus deal with a lot of different types, and last week we saw a betrayal set in motion by one of Jesus' followers, but that was just one difficult person among Jesus' close associates. We also saw these religious leaders who literally wanted Jesus dead. On the other hand, we saw a grateful woman who gave an extravagant gift in this offering of perfume because of her love for Jesus. And even though others were critical, Jesus betrayed her. Jesus defended her. Wow. Speaking of betrayal, Jesus knows what's coming, right? As Jesus has been with his disciples, he's aware of what is about to happen. He's been talking about it for some time. He says, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and when I'm there, I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to be persecuted, I'm going to die. But he's also talked about this idea of rising again, which has made no sense to them up to this point. Jesus knows what's coming. And last week we saw where he's now in Jerusalem. He's had this conflict with the religious leaders. We've seen that Judas has taken the first step of betrayal. And before things seemingly spin out of control, there is one more thing that Jesus wants to do. And that is he wants to celebrate the Passover meal with his disciples. Do you remember what it was like trying to meet up with people before we had cell phones? When I was in high school, I would have to call for a ride. Before I had my own car, I'd have to call my mom for a ride. And the only way to do that was to use the payphone outside the gym. But being really cheap and not wanting to spend a quarter just to get a ride, my mom and I worked out this code. You remember that as long as they didn't answer the phone, you got your quarter back? So I would put the quarter in, I'd dial, and then I let it ring 2 times and hang up. And Mom knew if the phone rang 2 times, that meant come pick me up. And so that was one way we tried to circumvent the system. Or how about following friends through town? Do you remember this? You're following friends through town, they're leading you someplace, and then you lose track of them. right? They take a turn at a signal light, you didn't make the signal, and now they're gone. And do you remember the kind of angst we would go through trying to figure out, well, now what do we do? Should we keep circling the block because maybe they're circling a different block? Should we just stop here and wait, but maybe they stopped over there and waited? Burnett and I had some friends in the 70s. We lost like that one time. We've never seen them since. No, that's not true. I think about those old mountain men. How did they do it? You read about these guys that they'd have their big rendezvous, and once a year, and they'd see each other, they'd trade furs and stories and stuff, and then it's like, okay, we'll meet back here by this tree in 12 months. Well, these are guys that don't carry daytimers. How do you even know when 12 months is up? And when you do show up at the tree, how long do you wait? Do you wait a week? Do you wait a month? At what point do you decide that a bear must have gotten Jeb? How do people live like that? And while I'm not exactly certain how Daniel Boone pulled it off, we do get some clues about how Jesus did it. Because while Jesus wants to celebrate Passover with his disciples, there are some logistics that have to happen. And one of those is they have to get a place to celebrate the dinner at within Jerusalem. It was important for them to have Passover supper in Jerusalem. So let's pick it up at Mark chapter 14, verse 12. On the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, 'The teacher says, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large upper room furnished and ready. There prepare for us." And the disciples set out and went to the city and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. If you're thinking about this, and if you think back on some of the previous passages we've studied, it may strike you this is rather parallel to what happened when Jesus first came into Jerusalem, back in Mark chapter 11. First, you may recall that he sends two disciples ahead, and then he tells them what to expect. In the first case, he says, you're going to go into a village, and when you enter it, you're going to find this colt, and you're supposed to untie it and bring it here. And if someone challenges you, just tell them the Lord has need of it, and they'll let you go. In this case, he says, go into the city. A man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Wherever he enters, say the teacher, needs this. Where's the guest room? And he'll show you a large upper room furnished and ready. So again, they find things, and the final is, then they go and they do it, and they find things just the way Jesus said. Very parallel examples. One of the questions is, was this another example of miraculous foreknowledge? Was it just that Jesus, because of his power, knew that there'd be a guy walking down the street with a jar of water that happened to have a large room where they could have the Passover? It's possible. There are some differences between this account and the one in Luke 11. First, you find that the disciples aren't sent to meet a particular person in Luke 11. They're just supposed to find a particular animal and untie it. And the disciples that went to get that colt are actually challenged by people. What are you doing? Why are you taking that animal? In this case, the person they meet up with seems very friendly to them. In fact, ready for them. This man leads them to this room, and it's already partly prepared. He seems to be expecting them. And know what Jesus says. He doesn't say that you will find a man. He says that a man will meet you. Okay? Matthew 26, verse 18, recounts the same story and says it a little bit differently. Jesus said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him." You'll note it also says that you're going to meet this man who is carrying a jug of water. Now, carrying a jug of water was distinctive for a man because in their culture that was primarily seen as women's work. And so to see a man walking down the street carrying a jug of water would catch your attention. So it appears that Jesus had probably already made some arrangements ahead of time, and he's telling these guys to go and meet up with the man that he has already talked to at some point. And the designator is, he's going to be carrying this jar of water. You meet up with him, you follow him, he's going to show you where we're going to have the Passover. Now the question is, why didn't Jesus just tell them where to go? Why didn't he say, just go to 324 Elm Street and that's the place? Well, for one thing, Jerusalem was just a labyrinth. I mean, to navigate through the streets to find a particular place, it was not laid out with the kind of simple precision that our streets usually are. And so to find someone, to have them lead you there was really essential. It's also quite possible that Jesus is intentionally keeping the location low profile because, as you may recall, the religious leaders are looking for a way to seize Jesus, to arrest him in secret, and to put him to death. And word has gotten back. Word apparently had gotten to Judas. It probably had gotten to Jesus as well. And it's very likely that at this point, Jesus knows already what Judas is up to. And that for that reason, he does not want anyone knowing where they're going to have the Passover until they arrive, so that Judas would not use that as an opportunity. Can't be sure about that, but it seems like a good possibility as to why Jesus uses a rather roundabout way of sending his disciples to prepare. Well, they go to have this meal, and there's no small talk at this Passover meal. Mark 14. And when it was evening, he came with the 12. And as they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." And they began to be sorrowful and to say to him one after another, "Is it I?" Matthew adds something to this because he records Judas' response in particular. Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Rabbi?" And he said to him, "You have said so." To me, this interchange tells us something about how thorough the betrayal was. The other disciples couldn't think who it was that might betray Jesus the way Jesus was describing. You've probably been in groups where someone says, maybe you've worked on a job, and the boss says, somebody around here is going to lose their job. And everybody kind of knows who that guy is because you know how he performs. In this case, Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And what you see is not all the heads pivoting to look at Judas going, it's you, isn't it? All they can think of, is it me? What kind of sense does this make? What do you mean one of us would betray you? Everyone, as far as I can tell, is completely loyal and devoted to you. You wonder what was going through Judas' mind as he looked Jesus in the eye and tried to fake astonishment? The wound of betrayal. To be betrayed by someone very close, that you love, that you've trusted. Jesus said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the dish with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." Saying that it's one who is dipping bread with me was just another way of saying it's someone right at this table. We are sharing a meal right now. It is one of you. I'm not talking about anyone outside of this room. In fact, Mark repeatedly specifies that it is the 12. In verse 17, when it was evening, he came with the 12. He said to them, "It is one of the 12. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12. Have you ever been betrayed? Have you ever had someone that was close to you that you trusted, that you loved, that had professed that they were your friend, that they loved you, who has betrayed you? David wrote a psalm, Psalm 55, all about the pain of betrayal. He says, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, I would wander far away. For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together within God's house. We walked in the throng. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. His speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they are drawn swords. I believe that Jesus experienced Judas' betrayal on a very human level. There were elements of his omniscience that he emptied himself of in coming to earth. He made himself dependent on his heavenly Father. I think that when Jesus called Judas to follow him, when he sent him out to minister, when he even entrusted him with the money, made him the treasurer for the group, if you will, I don't think at that point Jesus had the knowledge of who Judas really was. I don't believe the Father had revealed that to him yet, because Jesus experienced life the way we experience life. The time came that God the Father revealed the duplicity of Judas to his Son, but I think it came with all of the shock and the hurt that any of us feel who have been betrayed. I would just say that if you've been betrayed, I believe that Jesus understands the deep wound of your heart. He knows what that feels like. Well, they're still having this Passover meal together. It's taken kind of a heavy turn. People aren't sure what to make of it. But then Jesus mystifies them even more by upending their tradition. There was a lot of protocol to the Passover feast. Everything about it was rich in symbolism and history. Every item that was served had meaning. There was a carefully scripted rehearsing of Israel's history in Egypt and God's deliverance of them from slavery. The food would be served, and the host would recite a well-known liturgy that accompanied each part of the meal. For instance, when the platter of unleavened bread was served, it reminded them that when they left Egypt, there wasn't any time to let the bread rise. There was no leavening of the bread. And the host would say, as he lifted that platter of unleavened bread, he'd say, "This is the bread of affliction, which our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Let everyone who hungers come and eat. Let everyone who is needy come and eat the Passover meal." And then throughout the course of the dinner, there were 4 different cups of wine that were served. Each of them had a different name, different symbolism. After the main meal was eaten, the 3rd cup was taken, and the 3rd cup was called the cup of redemption, or the cup of blessing. And it's when Jesus comes to this 3rd cup, the cup of redemption, that he goes off script, and with the platter of unleavened bread. As they were eating, he took the bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." That wasn't the script. That must have made everyone look at each other, because that's not what the host says at this point. And now Jesus is taking this symbol and he's giving it a new meaning. He's saying this now symbolizes my body that is given for you. When it comes to the cup of redemption, it says that he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." This talk about blood of the covenant probably doesn't mean a whole lot to us. We don't think in these kinds of terms, but for these Israelites, these Jews, that had deep significance. It took them back to what they were celebrating, the memory of their deliverance out of Egypt, the Exodus, as God took them into the wilderness and took them to the promised land. And that language had been used before. Exodus 24. Then Moses took the book of the covenant and read it as the people listened. And they said, "Everything God said, we'll do. Yes, we'll obey." And Moses took the rest of the blood and threw it out over the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has made with you. Out of all these words I have spoken." There had been a sacrifice made, And some of the blood was symbolically sprinkled over the people. And he said, this represents a covenant that God has made with you. That first covenant was a written code. Remember, Moses read the words of the law, the words of the covenant to them, and the people all promised. They said, okay, that's God's part of the deal. We've got our part, which is to obey, and we will obey. How did they do with that promise? Not very good. The second covenant comes not in the form of a written code. The second covenant comes in the form of a person. Jesus says, this is my body given for you. This is my blood of the covenant that is poured out for many. And it was not based on their performance, but on his obedience. He offered himself to all of them. Think about this. Even Judas. Jesus knows who Judas is at this point. He knows that he's already set in motion the actions to betray Jesus. And yet, even with Jesus seated there, Jesus talks about his life being poured out, being available to them. Think about this within the context of Passover. There's a meal where a lamb was sacrificed and a remembrance that its blood had been symbolic covering for life when the people were suffering in bondage in Egypt. And then Jesus suddenly presents himself to his disciples as being the one that should be symbolically remembered. And he speaks of his own blood as being a sign of a new covenant. When Moses declared God's covenant to ancient Israel, it was sealed with the sprinkling of blood over the congregation. Jesus now says, my blood is the blood of a new covenant. He says it's a covenant that is for many. Not just for them, not just for the 12, but for many. Do you remember when Jesus cleansed the temple, what it was that made him so angry? It was the fact that they had filled up the court of the Gentiles with merchandise. There was no place for those outside of Israel to come and worship in a sacred place. And Jesus was angry because what he had come to do was not just for the 12, and it was not just for Israel. What he had come to do, he had come to do for many. You know, Jesus is painting a picture here, if you will. And this isn't just watercolors with kind of washes of pigment. He's using those thick oils with bright, vibrant colors, with depth to it. This is three-dimensional. We might even say it's four-dimensional. See, I think trying to describe what Jesus was doing in offering himself on the cross is very difficult. We try to attach all kinds of theological words to it as though we've got it all figured out and we understand it inside and out. There's a classic book written by Leon Morris called The Atonement, Its Meaning and Significance. For 230 pages, Leon Morris, a great theologian in his own right, tries to lay out what is the significance of what Jesus did in giving himself on the cross. And there's lots of big words. Words like reconciliation, justification, redemption, substitutionary sacrifice. My favorite, propitiation. But all of those things are efforts to understand what is it that Jesus did? What is the effect of it? How does it work? What was God trying to accomplish? And quite honestly, I'm not sure that we can adequately put words to it. And yet for people that embrace what Jesus has offered, it is nothing short of life-changing. While it may go into dimensions that we don't fully understand in the realm of the Spirit, the fact is when God creates in a person a new heart, when he forgives, when he cleanses us, when he brings us into his family, it changes us in profound ways. Kind of reminds me of those software license agreements that go on for page after page in fine print. You're probably like me, just click OK because you don't know what the whole thing says. But what worries you is that there's something buried in the fine print that may be harmful to you, right? Like I just signed over my computer to this company or something. But the contract that Jesus offers is the opposite. The most important clauses are all his responsibility. And whether you have been betrayed or whether you are a betrayer, Jesus offers himself to you. The offer ends with a promise. Mark 14:25. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. Jesus knows that a dark night, and in fact some dark days, lie just ahead. But it's not the end. That's not the end of the story. He's already looking ahead and he says, this party will resume. The next time this party happens, it will be in the fulfilled, realized kingdom of my Father, when we will sit together again and rejoice. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, you will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. Peter said to him, even though they all fall away, I will not. Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said the same thing. Who was right? Jesus or the disciples? Ever been them? Ever sworn to God, God, I'm your man. I'm your woman. And it doesn't matter what happens, you can count on me. I've given you my life. You've changed me. It is so real, and I will always be faithful and true. And then you find out that maybe you couldn't really stick by what you promised. And the words sound a little hollow when you begin to realize how you have fallen down in keeping that commitment. Contemplate his love. I started by talking about assessment testing. How much we would all like to know how people are going to perform in the future. That would save us getting associated with people that are going to be a bad employee or a bad spouse. But Jesus knew there was a traitor when he offered himself to them. Jesus knew that these guys who were swearing their allegiance, really, when push came to shove, were only fair weather friends. Jesus has no illusions about you or me. And yet he offers himself to us. Isn't that amazing? I love Romans 5, 6 and 8. 6 through 8. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He'd already done the assessment testing. He already knew who they were. He knows who we are. He says, while we were still sinners, while we were still living lives in rebellion against him, God, because of his love, chose to take the burden of our sin. God was not surprised to find out the kind of person that you are. It wasn't like one day he looked and he says, wow, that assessment test wasn't right. I thought you're going to be a really quality person. It turns out you're kind of weak. He knew. That's why he gave himself for you. No sooner did Jesus declare their faithless cowardice, then he promised that he would again go before them. Jesus said, "You will all fall away, for it's written, I'll strike the shepherd, the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I'll go before you to Galilee." Isn't that amazing? But that's because he's a shepherd. And you see, real shepherds are not put off by the fact that sheep act like sheep. They know what sheep do. Not real bright animals, pretty easily panicked. They run around a lot. And Jesus says, I know you guys. And when all of this comes down, you're going to run. The flock is going to scatter. But I'm not going to turn my back on you. When I'm risen, as a good shepherd does, I'll go before you again. I'm going to regather this flock. Well, of course, it's Jesus. And for Jesus, this kind of stuff, I'm sure, is a lot easier for him than it is for us, right? And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." And he came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Peter, James, and John. The last time we saw them taken by Jesus someplace, it was to that place of prayer on the Mount of Transfiguration. Do you remember that? This time it's another mountain, but it's not a mountain of glory, rather it is one of agony. The last time they saw Jesus radiant, surrounded by power. This time they see him grief-stricken, drop to his knees and face down on the ground. Mark uses 4 terms to describe Jesus' emotional state. He says first that he is greatly distressed, that he is greatly troubled, that he's very sorrowful, that he's sorrowful even to death. Was this easier for Jesus than it is for us? Hardly. Last time the Father had affirmed the Son on that Mount of Transfiguration. He said, "This is my Son whom I love." This time it's the Son who cries out to the Father and says, "If it's possible, let this cup pass from me." Last time the Son was basking in the Father's love, and yet this time the Son feels the abject horror of facing the Father's rejection as he prepares to take on himself the black stains of others. Last time we saw the disciples speechless with wonder. Maybe you remember, Peter blurts out this kind of dumb statement. It says, "Hey, we could build like 3 tabernacles here for you and everybody." And it says the reason he said this was because he didn't know what else to say. Speechless with wonder. This time, we see them speechless due to slumber. It says they didn't know what to say when Jesus came back and found them sleeping once again. In fact, that drowsiness becomes the focal point of the story. If you pay attention to Mark's account, the story of Jesus' prayers gets shorter and shorter. There's very little attention given to Jesus' prayer. Where the attention goes is he keeps coming back to these guys and he keeps finding them asleep time after time. Remember Jesus' exhortation earlier when he had talked about the impending judgment of Jerusalem? He said to his disciples 3 times, "Stay awake." They're not doing so good. We are sleepy people. And yet he loves us. Let us be going. My betrayer is at hand. From this point forward, we see Jesus move aggressively toward the darkness. He's poured his heart out. He has felt the grief. He has felt the betrayal. But now he stands up and he walks directly into the jaws. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and scribes and elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And they all left him and fled. Jesus understands what it means to be betrayed and forsaken. A kiss. In the dim light of night and torches, Judas needed some way to get in close and mark the target. Why didn't the other disciples stop Judas? I think it speaks again to the fact that they just didn't suspect him. He shows up suddenly, and even with these soldiers around, their first thought must have been, "Oh, poor Judas, he must have gotten in trouble." And Judas walks through the midst of them, and he kisses Jesus, and everyone's kind of standing watching, and suddenly Jesus is being arrested. And the truth dawns on them. This is the guy. This is the betrayal. There's a sword. John tells us that it was Peter who drew his sword. It says good things about Peter. Peter wasn't just all talk. Right here, right now, he is willing to fight to the death. But John tells us that Jesus told Peter to put the sword away, that he even healed the man that Peter struck. And with that, Peter and all the rest of them are at a loss as to what to do. If Jesus is simply going to surrender himself to these people, what can they do? And so they do the only thing that comes to their mind, and that is they run. Mark's account of Gethsemane concludes with an odd little mini drama. The 12 run away, and there's someone else. He says a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. I guess this was the first toga we have record of. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Nobody knows for sure who this young man is. Some have thought that maybe it was even Mark himself. But can there be a more graphic picture of fear than running naked into the night? Let me say again, you are loved. You have been loved by God on your brightest and strongest day. You've been loved by God on your darkest night, when faith has deserted you, and when you ran naked from him into the dark. Maybe you have completely blown it this week. I don't know what it is, but you do. Maybe the only reason that you came to church this morning is because if you didn't show up, you figured that your family and friends would know that something was wrong. And so you thought at least being here would cover for that. Maybe you showed up in church hoping that being in church on Sunday would somehow make up for a shameful Wednesday. God does want you to walk in freedom. God's heart aches for your failure. Jesus felt the full weight of my sin, of your sin. And he does want us to leave behind whatever that trash is that trips us up. But it's not because leaving it behind is what earns his love. Jesus loved those men. He loved the women that followed him, not because they were perfect people. He knew who they were. He knew how weak they were. He knew how faithless they could be. And yet he loved them and he gave himself for them. It's not to earn his love. He calls us to walk free because he wants us to experience the freedom that he purchased for us. The reason that he paid the price on the cross. One of my favorite prayers in all the Bible comes out of Ephesians chapter 3. It starts at verse 16. I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the saints, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge. Don't you love that? I want you to know something that is beyond your ability to know. Lose yourself in the attempt to comprehend how much God loves you. Why? So that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. May God fill us with the knowledge of the depth and the breadth and the height and the unknowable immensity of his love for us. Love that even when he knows results of our assessment tests, he said, I will go to a cross for you because I love you. I asked Burnett if she would lead us in an old hymn. How old is it? 1875. 1875. Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus.